it would be difficult to find a more sophist argument. That's it. That's the whole discourse out of Los Angeles, and that I'm using this simply to make a critical point, which is that I'll call this anti-intellectualism because it's more broad and more generic than say, censorship. But this seems to be increasing in our institutional, scholarly, critical, aesthetic life. The discourses I've just discussed are as common as pizza. What's interesting is that their, quote, calculations, memories, and stories, close quote, radically displace. What happened at MoCA is war. And so one can ask, how did MoCA and the comments above calculate their effect? In other words, from a critical perspective, it would have been much more intelligible, socially available knowledge if the people in positions of authority in Los Angeles had simply put some pressure. Is this censorship? Is this anti-intellectualism? Is this violent business? Or got anything on the table would have made it more intelligible. And so we then see that there's a high degree of correlation between anti-intellectualism and the unintelligible, or taking events and making them unavailable for social critical understanding. I'm saying that in Los Angeles, then, with its new mix of artists, academics, and institutions, there's another new thing. Artists terrified of critical upheaval that implicates the doings of art. I have one more, even longer example. This is from a book written by Boris Groys, Art Power. And I brought this example with me because I'm in an institution, I'm in a museum, and Groys's argument, I thought it would be appropriately ironic to talk about museums in a museum. Groys has written a very smart but also very disturbing book called Art Power. It was published last year by MIT Press. His basic argument is that critical, self-reflexive contemporary artwork, critical, contemporary, self-reflexive artwork hinges on paradox. The working toolkit of contemporary art is to start with the notion that art is part of a paradoxical social relationship. The artist who calls into question state authority with an elaborate installation, mixing video, text, documents, grilling boundary issues between work and audience, object and history, sometimes furthers education, sometimes furthers art, sometimes both at the same time. Groys insists that modern art saved itself from redundancy and worse by becoming a, quote, paradox object. For example, conceptual art used, quote, iconoclastic gestures directed against it and turned these gestures into new modes of art production, close quote. He doesn't give an example, but I think a fair one would be Picasso and Braque, Mademoiselle d'Avignon, is that the? Yeah, Mademoiselle, where they take newspaper clippings, put them in the painting, thereby violating, and appropriating and violating at the same time common, scorned, everyday objects which had been more or less carefully kept out of art. Paradox is then, for Groys, a kind of sanctuary for art. It's a safe space for art, or artists working. Sanctuary denotes, of course, a relation of dependence. Instead of pursuing this, however, Art Power insists that while selection can involve mistakes, curators make mistakes, can make mistakes, the discourse retreats to selection held necessary for more selection. Quote, to draw our attention to interesting or relevant art that is overlooked by institutions, close quote. In other words, it's the requirement of contemporary institutions to correct for the errors of past institutions what they ignored, and therefore changes of regime and institutions and the creation of new institutions is itself a kind of historical self-correction for the omissions and sins of previous institutionalizations of art. The autonomy of art, according to Greuze, in full paradox, then passes to the site of the exhibition and the museum. Art's resistance to ideology is imaged by Greuze as, quote, the international exhibition, close quote, claimed to be, quote, the image of the perfect balance of power, close quote. Sometimes a critique of hierarchies, and sometimes a new institutionalization. He gives the museum exhibition a quasi-transcendental status because it allows audiences and curators to compare the past and the present, which ensures art's future or power to, quote, rediscover artistic visions and projects pointing toward the introduction of aesthetic quality, close quote. Are curators really the heir, however, of the artist's once upon a time, quote, magical abnormalities, close quote? In other words, all those crazy artists, now the spirit that infused Van Gogh, Goya, in Foucault's interpretation at least, is that kind of critical spiritual energy now transferred to the curators? Okay, how? He doesn't say. Making unseen, profane, that is, material, non-religious things visible, is glued to the affirmation that exhibitions in and of themselves are a kind of medicine. At one point he says, curators cure. Yeah, I love that one. Curators cure. Curators curate. And he, in fact, relies heavily on that language, and he is blind as a bat to the use, or he's like a, well, he's blind to the idea then that there's any problematical, conceptual, social, intellectual, problematic to be found in the concept of the curator. One could not ask for a greater validation of the autonomy, independence, irresponsibility of the curator. Which is, in fact, what's happening in American society. The artists are more dependent than ever on the goodwill and other kinds of will of the curators. The media takes the place of the bad state, while the museum assumes the place of subjective memory that is now given durative or enduring temporal value. The museum exhibition is the saving grace, what I call the sanctuary, against the art markets. Again, however, he does not consider that the museum itself is an art market. The museum market, the market of art museums. And he does not consider that the museum is a place for the politics of memory, the politics of selection, the politics of neo-monumentalization of contemporary art, or that the education of curators is a saturation in total politics. Let me give a few more examples from his argument here, because some of it is extremely, you can't even be critical of it because it's so present. And in other words, as we know, contemporary art is overwhelmingly concerned with documentation, documentary art. So here's what he has to say about that. Art documentation makes living things out of artifactual things, quote, whether real or fictive, and is primarily narrative, and thus it evokes the unrepeatability of living time, close quote. Concepts unavailable in real experience can be experienced really as art. The unrepeatability of living time, living again as art. Art is not simulation, but reality itself. The contemporary museum goer prefers the copy, has no interest whatsoever in the original. When a museum shows a copy, it becomes an original event. He's a very smart critic. He's working the language of paradox all the way around the institutional edges. but his apology for museums, quote, art is most alive due to the inner logic of museum collecting itself, close quote. The museum assigns life to art because the museum is an ever-paradoxical performance, quote, compels the artist to go into reality, into life, and make art that is seen as being alive, close quote. Without asking whether the museum's logic of action is political, financial, based on the teachable, etc., Groys defaults to the transcendence of the museum. Compared to its presencing, quote, the real can be defined only in comparison with the museum collection. The real can be, the real only exists because there are museums. Think about that. If we didn't have museums, we wouldn't know what was real. This is utterly fantastic. Quote, reality can be defined in this context as the sum of all things not yet collected. Close quote. That means reality can be defined as everything that is dead until the museum gives it some life. This is really, I mean, if I was a curator, man, I'd send this guy a check. Quote, our image of reality is dependent on our knowledge of the museum, close quote. And in case you think I'm making it up, that's page 25 in this text. Quote, again, our image of reality is dependent on our knowledge of the museum, close quote. He does not flinch from the metaphysics. Quote, only the new can be recognized by the museum-trained gaze as real, present, alive, close quote. Only the new can be recognized by the museum-trained gaze as real, present, or alive. In effect, what he's done is to say that the entirety of the intellectual comparative method, the method of comparison, is now to be found in museums. This is what scholars, the founding of the historical disciplines in the 1860s in France, England, and Germany, as many commentators have noticed, this was exactly the same argument. We could only know the past once we wrote it up via the scientization provided by historians. Scientization has simply been replaced by the concept of the gaze, one of the most frightful notions, of course, in contemporary theory. He is trying to say that museums grant recognition to art that is iconoclastic. Quote, the curator is an agent of art's profanation, its secularization, its abuse. But there is no probe, and close quote, but there's no probe or investigation of why it is a good thing that curators fashion exhibitions made out of, quote, their own contradictory stories, close quote. Okay, I think the point's well made. Right? Or maybe, how about one more quote? Quote, life looks truly alive only if we see it from the perspective of the museum, close quote.